In the quiet corners of the world, the shadows hold stories that beg to be uncovered. Welcome to Silent Shadows, a place where mysteries thrive and suspense keeps you guessing. Each episode takes you deeper into the unknown, challenging you to find the clues hidden in plain sight. Let's begin this journey into the dark, where every silence speaks volumes.
The Estate, a mystery story by GravepitShadows. The storm rolled in like a vengeful spirit, cloaking the Hargrave Estate in an oppressive shroud of darkness. Rain lashed against the tall windows, and the wind howled through the eaves as if seeking entry. Inside, the mansion was silent, save for the scratch of Walter Hargrave's pen on paper. Walter sat at his desk in the study, surrounded by the tools of his trade, towers of books, scattered notes, and his trusted typewriter. A steaming cup of tea sat untouched beside him, its faint scent mingling with the room's musty air. He was working on what he promised would be his final masterpiece, a locked room mystery to outshine them all. He glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight, and rubbed his temples. A faint knock interrupted his thoughts.
"What is it?"
he barked. "Just me, sir," came the timid voice of his maid, Lila. "Shall I bring your tea now?"
"No interruptions,"
he snapped, glaring at the closed door. He heard her retreating footsteps and returned to his work. His hand hovered over a final sentence. Betrayal is always closer than we think. The storm raged outside as the light in the study flickered. Then there was silence. Morning came reluctantly, the rain easing to a drizzle. Lila Garner, ever punctual, prepared Walter's breakfast tray. As she approached the study, a sense of unease prickled at her. The house had felt heavier since the storm, as though it had absorbed the tension of its occupants. She knocked on the door. "Mr. Hargrave, breakfast is ready." No response. "Mr. Hargrave?" She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. A cold knot formed in her stomach as she turned the knob. The door creaked open, and the sight before her made her gasp. Walter was slumped over his desk, his head resting on his arms. The teacup lay on its side, its contents spilled across papers. The air smelled faintly of almonds, and a puddle of liquid had soaked into the carpet. Lila stepped back, her tray clattering to the floor as she screamed. Detectives Rachel Mills and James Davenport arrived as the estate buzzed with the news of Walter's death. Rachel, a sharp-eyed investigator with a cool demeanor, led the way into the study. The scene was disturbingly ordinary, aside from the body. Walter appeared to be asleep at his desk. Rachel noted the spilled tea and the faint scent in the air. "Cyanide," she muttered. James, more impulsive but equally skilled, examined the room. Locked from the inside, no signs of forced entry. Classic locked room scenario. Rachel crouched beside the desk, her gloved hand brushing a torn scrap of paper. It bore the words, "Final betrayal." "Looks like Mr. Hargrave was working on more than just his book," she said. James gestured to the window where faint dirt smudges marred the sill. "Window's been opened recently." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Or someone wanted us to think it was." The Hargrave matriarch, Marianne, sat in the parlor, a picture of controlled composure. Her gray eyes betrayed a storm beneath the surface. Rachel and James took seats across from her. "I understand this is difficult," Rachel began, "but we need to know about your relationship with your husband." Marianne poured herself tea with steady hands. "Walter was demanding. His work came first, always, but he was my husband." "Any trouble in the marriage?" Rachel pressed. Marianne's fingers tightened on her cup. Trouble? Detective, all marriages have their challenges. That doesn't make me a killer. James leaned forward. Did you know about the new will? Marianne's cup clattered onto its saucer. New will? What are you talking about? We found a shredded draft in his desk, Rachel said calmly. It names his assistant, Clarissa Boyd, as his sole heir. Marianne's mask slipped for a moment, anger flashing across her face. Clarissa? That girl? He must have lost his mind. Nathan Hargrave met them in his studio, a cluttered room filled with half-finished canvases and splashes of paint. He greeted them with a bitter smile. So you think I killed my father, he said, crossing his arms. Can't say I blame you. We're just asking questions, Rachel replied. What was your relationship with your father like? Nathan laughed hollowly. He hated me. Always did. Called me a failure. Said I wasn't worthy of the Hargrave name. Where were you last night? James asked. In here, painting. I heard him arguing with someone, though. Couldn't make out who it was. What about the typewriter in the corner? Rachel pointed. It matches the letters your father received. Nathan stiffened. Those weren't from me. I didn't need to send him letters to tell him how much I hated him. I said it to his face. Clarissa Boyd was visibly shaken when the detectives approached her. She clutched a notebook to her chest as though it were armor. Mr. Hargrave was a genius, she said. He could be difficult, but he was kind to me. Kind enough to leave you everything? Rachel asked, watching her reaction. Clarissa's eyes widened. What? No, I didn't know about that, I swear. James frowned. You didn't notice him drafting a new will? You're his assistant. I handle his manuscripts, not his personal affairs. Clarissa's voice wavered. Please, I had nothing to do with this. Roger Fenwick, Walter's longtime business partner, greeted the detectives in the library. His handshake was firm, but his eyes darted nervously. Walter and I had our differences, he admitted, but we were partners. I'd never harm him. Rachel leaned forward. What about your financial troubles? Roger bristled. Those are temporary setbacks. Walter understood that. Enough to cover for you? James asked. Roger stood abruptly. I think we're done here. The greenhouse smelled of earth and rain. Graham Powell, the estate's gardener, was trimming roses when the detectives found him. His rugged face was lined with age, and his hands were rough, dirt embedded beneath his nails. Graham avoided eye contact as Rachel asked, Mr. Powell, where were you last night? In my quarters, he replied gruffly. Didn't hear nothing. Storm was too loud. Rachel studied him carefully. But you work near the east wing, don't you? The study faces the garden. Graham hesitated, his shears pausing mid-snip. I saw someone, near the study window. Didn't think much of it at the time. Who did you see? James pressed. Graham glanced at the detectives, then back to his roses. It was Mr. Fenwick. He was sneaking around like he didn't want to be seen. Rachel's expression didn't change, but James's eyes widened. Why didn't you come forward sooner? I didn't want trouble, Graham muttered. This family's got enough of that. Rachel and James regrouped in the estate's drawing room, going over their notes. Graham's testimony puts Roger near the scene, but it's circumstantial, James said, pacing. We still need something concrete. Rachel nodded thoughtfully. Then let's consider the timeline. Walter argued with someone late at night. The tea tray was brought early in the morning. Cyanide would have acted quickly, meaning it was likely administered just before the tea was served. She tapped her notebook. The sugar cubes. Marianne handled the tray, but someone else must have tampered with them earlier. James frowned. That would mean whoever did it had access to the kitchen, or to Marianne herself. Rachel's phone buzzed, interrupting their discussion. It was a report from the lab. fingerprints on the missing master key had matched Roger Fenwick. The detectives confronted Roger in his room. He was seated by the fire, his calm demeanor cracking under Rachel's sharp gaze. "We found the missing key, Roger," Rachel began. "It had your fingerprints all over it." Roger's face turned pale.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Rachel leaned in, her tone icy. "You knew about the new will, didn't you? Walter was planning to expose your embezzlement, cut you out of the publishing company entirely."
That's ridiculous,
Roger snapped, standing abruptly. Walter didn't trust you anymore," James interrupted. "And you knew you'd lose everything unless you stopped him." Roger's shoulders slumped, but he shook his head. "You have no proof." Rachel smiled thinly. "Not yet, but we will." Rachel returned to the kitchen, retracing the steps leading to Walter's tea. She examined the sugar bowl on the counter, noticing the faintest residue of powder clinging to the inside. "Who had access to this?" she asked the housekeeper. "Everyone, Detective," the woman replied. "We don't lock the kitchen." Rachel frowned. The open access complicated matters, but it also pointed to premeditation. She noticed the sugar bowl had been cleaned recently, yet the faint residue remained. The suspects were gathered in the study under the watchful eyes of Rachel and James. Rain pattered against the windows as the tension in the room grew. Rachel began, her voice steady. "Walter Hargrave's death was no accident. It was a carefully planned murder. The cyanide was placed in the sugar cubes, knowing they'd end up in his tea." She turned to Marianne. "You prepared the tea tray, but the poison was already in place. Someone used your routine to frame you." Marianne gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "I didn't." The real killer had access to the study and knew about Walter's habits. She faced Nathan next. "You argued with your father, but your hatred wasn't enough to kill him. However, you provided the perfect distraction." Nathan scowled. "So who did it?" Rachel's gaze locked on Roger. "Roger Fenwick." The room erupted in gasps. Roger stood, his face pale but defiant. "This is absurd!" Rachel stepped closer, her tone sharper. "You knew Walter was going to expose you. You tampered with the sugar cubes the night before, staged the dirt on the windowsill to create a false lead, and planted the key to throw us off." Roger's composure cracked.
You can't prove anything.
James smirked. "Your fingerprints on the key beg to differ." Roger sagged, his bravado evaporating. He was going to ruin me. I had no choice. Roger was taken away in handcuffs, his protests echoing through the halls. Marianne sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames. Nathan lingered in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Outside, Rachel and James stood under the awning, the rain easing into a soft drizzle. "This place feels cursed," James said. Rachel shook her head. "Not cursed, James, just people. Greed, betrayal, and desperation, they're the real villains." Back at the estate as dawn broke, the light touching the windows of Walter's study. Inside, his unfinished manuscript lay open, the final line visible. "Betrayal is always closer than we think."
Another tale has come to a close, but the shadows never rest. Thank you for exploring this mystery with us on Silent Shadows. If you enjoyed this episode, show your support by hitting like, sharing it with your friends, and subscribing for more gripping stories. What was your favorite clue? What theories did you have? Let us know in the comments. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your wits sharp. The shadows have much more to reveal.